Welcome to Silent Book Club Author Chats. My name is Laura Gluhanic, co-founder of Silent Book Club, and joining me is my co-founder Guinevere, as well as Kristen Millares Young, author of Subduction. Welcome, Kristen. Thank you so much for being here. Just to start, would love to learn a little bit about you and your background.
So I began as a journalist. I was a reporter for a series of newspapers, many of which have closed, indicating the ongoing socioeconomic collapse of some of the greatest underpinnings of our democracy. So I'll go ahead and round them off just so we pour a little out for these people. So I worked for the Buenos Aires Herald, which had been open since 1868 in Buenos Aires, which started as a Scottish shipping news and closed. Then I worked, but it didn't close when I was there. I had moved on to work for the Miami Herald, which is still open, but a radical diminishment of its staff. I went from there to, of course, I worked at Time Magazine for a period of time. That's seen a lot of changes as well. Then from there, went to Seattle Post Intelligencer. May she rest in peace. She closed after, she was open from 1863 to 2009. At that time, I co-founded a nonprofit investigative newsroom called Investigate West, which had offices is ongoing and now is based in Seattle. And I'm very proud to say that that organization, which I led as board chair for the 3 years after the last election, helped to create 15 new laws through the impetus of catalyzing public opinion with investigative reporting. And those laws were to increase government transparency, to ease the lives of people of color who are caught in the criminal justice system by beginning to close some of the trap doors that continually devastate communities of color who are disproportionately fined and incarcerated for crimes for which their white counterparts go free, as well as healthcare workers who were dealing with toxic agents, chemical agents, chemotherapy, chemicals, and a number of other peoples. And the thing is, though, is as much as I really enjoyed and still do practice journalism, I'm an ongoing freelancer for, I started with the New York Times as a freelancer. I was very fortunate to be on a Pulitzer Prize winning team for them for a project called Snowfall, the avalanche at Tunnel Creek, which was kind of a watershed moment within digital narrative because people are realizing how much you can take out of the linear verbal narrative and put into graphic, put into topos, put into imagery, put into documentary snippets, and really begin to work with the whole texture of all the different kinds of reporting that there are, visual and in print. Then I started writing for The Guardian. I think the project that I'm most proud of for The Guardian was a year-long investigation into the disappearance of a woman I wish I had met while she was alive. Her name was Misty Upham, and she was a Blackfeet actress who appeared next to Julia Roberts and Benicio del Toro. She was probably the best known Native American actress at the time of her disappearance. And I spent a year trying to figure out why the police did not look for her. And what I found was that there was systemic racism in that Auburn Police Department, and which is endemic throughout our whole system. The whole hashtag missing and murdered Indigenous women would not be in existence today if actual law enforcement provided care equally to all the communities that they serve. So from there, I began reporting for the Washington Post. I can continue. I have got another piece coming out on October 14th, a profile of a young woman of color who is leading a women's shelter for domestic violence survivors. And it's part of an ongoing series about the lives of American workers who are essential. And I also write book reviews for them, and returning to my childhood love of novels and understanding that the work that they can create or catalyze within the minds of individuals like myself and you is worthwhile. It can be hard sometimes after you've been in direct service or, kind of direct, we published this story and then the lawmakers passed a law. You have this direct impact, which feels powerful and is powerful. And yet there's this other thing that needs to happen, which is that we need to condition ourselves as a thinking populace to really consider our surroundings and consider our own responsibilities to those surroundings. And I think that books do a very good job of that kind of primordial shifting within the self. I liken it to the kinds of reorientation that needs, as we have someone who's like on a different planet, which I love. Thank you, Tammy, for your background. I think of it as like looking up at the night sky, this reorientation that needs to happen. We think that we're looking up. We often say we're looking up at the night sky, but there is no sense of direction within the universe. That sense of direction is entirely located by gravity and our place on this planet. So really, we're looking out. We could just as easily be, think about the Little Prince, be looking down.
Mm-hmm.
And so often when we hold deeply entrenched views, our positionality is a force with the equivalence of gravity. It holds us in place, and we're not able to consider our stance or what we are observing or how it is that we are disregarding our position and imposing our direction on the field that we're of observation. That is as true of moral questions, socioeconomic questions, political questions, as it is looking at the night sky. And so that's why I really to write a book took me a very long time. I started researching this book in 2005. I did not start to write for a full 2 years after I began research. That research was multivalenced. I read everything written by, about, and for the Macaw people, as well as repeatedly returning to Nia Bay on visits that have extended long beyond when I stopped writing and had submitted the book. Because now, although it's a very diverse community in Nia Bay, I do have a series of really good friends that host me in their homes and that I also host in my home with my family. And that for me is a really big deal. To bring my children to someone's home and to rest there is an ultimate trust. And I feel the same way about when I receive someone in my home. And one of the things that really impresses me about Macaw culture, in one way that it really is akin to the Cuban culture that I was raised in, is that hospitality is at a premium. So being hospitable, I mean, the actual name Macaw, their self-given name is Quidichach. So people of the Cape, people of the Gulls and Rocks, but Macaw is actually a mangled Clallam term, which means, never leaves without being hungry. You never leave being hungry. So you're full when you leave. And that's true. I mean, literally, I actually had to learn that I actually had to either bring a cooler with me or accept the styrofoam coolers that my beautiful friends would put like halibut and smoked cod collars or whatever into. And then similarly, that I need to increase the scale of my bring, because it's not a bottle of wine on the Macaw reservation, right? And so that kind of learning, right, of mutuality and the creation of an ongoing relationship is, I think, the truest reward of having made this book, which, because it's published independently, there is a nonprofit independent press called Red Hen Press, based in Pasadena, California. They have put out a number of really wonderful books by all kinds of writers. Really, their docket is probably one of the most diverse that I have seen, commercial or indie alike. And I'm grateful to them for deciding to publish this book. I signed with them in 2018.
Oh, wow.
That gives you an idea about the extent of publishing timelines that are regularly misunderstood, given that there are some books like, how Trump, cratered the White House can come out in 9 months, right? Because there is a machine that is supporting that book and buoying that book towards publication and timeliness to get the copies to move off the shelves.
Right.
These kind of questions, this collision of indigeneity and diaspora that I explore in Subduction, is what we call an evergreen, right? It is,
Right.
At least in news, we used to call them that. It's something that has been relevant since the foundation of our nation. And because of that, it can be very easy to disregard. It can be easy to not to take it into account. It can be easy to exclude it from the reckoning when thinking about the racial issues that we continue to have in this nation that was founded upon genocide and slavery. And so
let's actually
Sorry.
take
Yeah.
let's take a break, because I actually I love that you're sharing sort of the background and things, but and there are a number of folks here who have read the book, but I also know there are a few that are waiting for their copies. So just for, you know, the internet at large who watches this, could you just share kind of in a capsule what you're exploring in this book, what the really the plot is, like what it's about?
Sure. So I've called it the tagline is it's a lyric retelling of the troubled history of encounter in the Americas, right? But it's as seen through this particular situation, which is of a Latina anthropologist, someone who has been grappling with the long trajectory toward whiteness that is assimilation into the power structures of this nation, who has recently been jilted by her husband, who left her for her sister, who was more available to him and not as much of a careerist as Claudia is. So Claudia, rather than being like, oh, my husband just left me for my sister, I probably need to take some time to reflect on this. She does what so many of us are doing in the pandemic, which is powering through in a state of extreme distress. Extreme, right? So many of us could really use a break, and it would probably enrich our lives and our communities if we did take time to reflect whether or not we're serving the values that we believe in, right? That we're not mindlessly continuing a trajectory that no longer makes sense within this tide of death that our world is experiencing.
Yeah, I was just saying, checking in on whether the values and so you have stay. This is something that's come up in some discussions I've had where like someone's values have shifted in recent years for a variety of reasons.
Well, and that's the thing, is that the hope would be that your values would be deepened in this time. It is, of course, an ongoing disappointment to so many of us how the polarization of our political rhetoric and our national communication that's filtered through social media doesn't seem to be bringing us to a finer point about what it is that we as a nation and what we as individual communities need to do to assure a healthier future for ourselves and our children and our planet. But Claudia does what we all do, right? She drags her damage with her. There is nothing left behind. And so she brings this very loaded charge into a research trip in Nia Bay, which is the ancestral home of the Macaw Nation, the Quitichach people. And they have been working with her, some members of the tribe have been working with her on a research project that is about the songs that are a communal touchstone for the tribe and are also particular to families and to certain lineages. In that work, she has been working with an elder named Maggie, who during the time of their interaction has become a hoarder and has been a hoarder, but she's contracted dementia. Mm-hmm. And so she's no longer able to really give consent for the work that she and Claudia are doing together. And consent is something that's very important to this book. It's looked at from a variety of different means, all of which are meant to provoke and trouble new thought. And so Claudia comes to this reservation and she's supposed to be working with these people, and she comes across Peter, who is just recently returned to take care of his mother, Maggie. He had fled decades earlier as a result of a traumatic experience, the disappearance of his father and the circumstances surrounding that. And in that time on the road, he too has grappled with what Shin Yu Pai in the Los Angeles Review of Books called the racial grief of being severed from your home culture, and the cynicism and hardening, the calcification, the misogyny, frankly, that he carries is real, in part because he has not been nurtured in community and has instead been, what does he say? He says that employers were the sole architects of his time, which he hated. And how many of us is that true for, right? Most of us who are in the working world we are pushed around by the needs of the corporations that serve our world. And to the extent possible, I wanted to, through the collision of Peter and Claudia, Claudia quickly flouts all ethical boundaries that would keep her and the community safe. And she immediately is a hot mess, right? She's just a mess. And and that's what a lot of people do when they're traumatized and scarred, is that they hurt other people. And at the same time, she also tries to play this role where she is trying to bridge this chasm between this mother and son who don't know how to talk to each other. And Peter's interested in Claudia. And so he is kind of drawn into this family project through her presence in such a way that I won't reveal what happens towards the end of the book. But her presence is nuanced in that it does allow for some connectivity, but it also creates and deepens fissures that had been moving through this community for many hundreds of years since contact. So that's what it's about.
And I wanted to share and bring in some of the questions that came from our community. And I'm actually going to move to one because you did bring this up. And the question is sort of, as you know, you started researching this more than 15 years ago. How did you make sure not to replicate any of the mistakes of your protagonist, of Claudia, while doing your field work? And particularly, I think it's using the knowledge for your own reward, or obviously, how do you care and take care as you're showing their culture sort of externally?
Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things that's the very subject matter of the book, is critically examining the entire impulse from outsiders to go into communities like this and then share their truths for some outside purpose. I will go ahead and say that being a novelist is socioeconomically devastating. So let's put aside for a moment, though, the financial reward, which is not there. At least not for me. If you find a writer or novelist who's making on their novels, yay, I'm so glad for them. However, for me, actually, the process of the work is the light. It is the reward. The process of making this book, creating the knowledge base that allowed me to make this book, was my reward for having made it. Claudia does something that I saw in a footnote that was in a book called The Macaw Indians by Elizabeth Colson, a Radcliffe-educated anthropologist who, there are quite a few female anthropologists actually who went out to and continue to visit Macaw territory, and the vast majority of them do not participate in the kinds of activities that you will see her do on the page, okay? However, Elizabeth Colson, I was so fascinated in listening to this or reading this. It was in a footnote. She told the Macaw people that she was there to learn about their history. And the whole time she was actually studying whether or not they had assimilated to mainstream US culture. So she lied to the people that she was studying in order to keep them in a natural state so that she would be able to observe them without the Heidegger principle of the observation changing the atom of light, the particle of light, right, and moving it around. Claudia, similarly, in an attempt, I believe, at first she's trying to, first of all, this woman lies to herself all the time, so that happens, right? But she doesn't show up as herself. She's asking for intimacies that are very deep from these people, and yet she declines to reveal anything about herself in any way. And when she is asked a question, she immediately elides. She outright deceives. She says whatever she needs to say in order to, in her mind, control the outcome of gaining continued access to this community. I will say there were incredibly awkward moments in my, decade-long period of writing and researching this book, where, I'm like, I'm writing a novel, and they're like, and then you have to have that conversation, right? Showing up for that conversation as my full self, was one of the ways that I tried to unmake the colonial process of research extraction. I wrote an essay about this for Literary Hub called Decolonizing the Research Process. Part of it is that two things. There's the co-creation of research, participatory research, which is very much where anthropology as a field has moved and continues to move towards that. An example of that is when you're an investigative journalist, for example, people say, oh, I gave that journalist an interview. It is a gift because the journalist will never share that transcript with you, right? That interview belongs to them. Unless you were co-recording it at the time, you have just given that knowledge away, and now they can do with it as they will. And because most journalists may keep the recording or may not, or may just be putting chicken scratch, there is very little that a subject of a story can do to challenge the depiction of a conversation that they had. You know, it may be that a journalist represented it correctly with the pull quote that they gave, and it may be that they made it sensational because the pull quote was at the very apex of emotionality of a very long interview that was full of reason, full of data, right? And then when the person loses it because they're talking about something, they're like, then we quote that. You know, in my practice as a journalist, I've done my very best not to do that. Not even for the best quotes. I have actually left the best quotes on the table, and I won't tell my editors that, but that's what I do. And part of that is because you're not just trying to glean the best from an interview, but you're trying to actually accurately represent what this person said, what they believe, what they're trying to affect for their community. In the case of this book, you know, a lot of my friends who are Macaw, you know, some of them aren't real novel readers, right? Some of them are, some of them aren't. So for those who were, like Mara Parker, who is the board chair of the Macaw Cultural and Research Center, I gave her a copy of the book and I said, I welcome your thoughts. And one of the things that, and this is before publication, of course, and one of the things that I really appreciated actually was this past week, I had an event for Hugo House, which is a Seattle-based literary nonprofit that I served as prose writer in residence for the past 2 years. And Mayor made sure, and this is something she knows how to do because she's board chair, right? So she knows how to gather community and she's very savvy about, you know, everything. But she put in the discussion board for the event, you know, I'm so sorry, I'm having surgery this week. I can't be there. I'm with you in spirit. To me, if nothing else happens at all for this book, I am replete, right? Because it means so much to me to have spent so much time to earn the respect of the women who are the stewards of this culture for its, you know, they're the people who it actually belongs to, which are the Macaw. Now, one of the things that I did in the design of the book is that throughout the book, and I can talk about this more later because I know I'm sorry, I'm kind of talky, but fractals are a very important underlying element of the book. And part of the reason for that is that it became very clear to me that it was almost impossible to escape the fractals of historical oppression when arriving to a community that has been so impacted by contact. Okay, yeah. So it's nearly impossible not to err. But what I see a lot of people doing now is that they're failing to engage in any way. They're so afraid of showing up and being seen in a certain way that they're not showing up at all for Indigenous peoples. And that is a mistake. And as Desmond Tutu says, if you are silent during times of oppression, then you have opted for the side of the oppressor. So any person who believes that they have progressive values regarding Indigenous communities and yet fails to engage with and advocate for the rights of those communities is in fact still a white supremacist. Period. That's what it is. So for me, I would rather show up, engage in a very deep way, and then do my very best to, through the prism of a character who is so unlike me, right? who I damn in my mind in sometimes,
Mhm.
right? And yet who also, because of her own troubled relationship with her ethnicity, with her race, with her ex-husband and his whiteness, with her professional environment and its tokenism, with all of the factors that condition her positionality with the United States, I was able to kind of examine what it means for those people who are minorities. I guess not a term we use anymore, but when I was growing up, we still used it, like me, you know, who can be assimilated into the power structure because she is white passing, right?
Right.
Ah, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And so that means a lot. That differentiation is very, very important because there are some people who can accrue the benefits of this settler colonial state as a result of their faces and the way that they are perceived, and there are those who cannot. But on the question of whiteness, I would like to offer something by Alyssa Washuta, who's a Cowlitz writer. And she said that whiteness is not a phenotype, it's a way of relating. So it is possible to puncture one's own whiteness while still inhabiting it. So
it's interesting that I remember, I think there was some event this year that I attended that was about diversity and inclusion, which is a lot of what I study. And there was a question of what is one word that you use to define privilege, and the one that struck me was safety. And I think, to me, you talking about, you know, white privilege and white supremacy, like, to me, that is such a mirror of, if you have that, you have the safety, and if you're not engaging with it, you know, and the risk is still so low, but that is what you're kind of engaging with, is your position of safety. Because it's, to me, it's a little different than power, which definitely is part of it, but so many people don't self-identify with a power. But I think with safety, it is more accessible. One other question I wanted to bring in is around location, and specifically, if you could get into a little bit more about where the Macaw land is, and how that comes into play, why this location and this people, this nation was who you sort of identified to engage with.
well, okay, a couple of things. I mentioned earlier the idea about fractals, and like, could this be based anywhere else and you know, be the same story? And the answer is no. This culture, these peoples are indigenous to this particular land, and it was I think it was 2005 when I, for the first time, went out to Nia Bay, and I was struck by a couple of things. One, it is one of the most beautiful places on this earth. It is the northwest tip of the lower 48. It is bordered on one side by the Strait of Juan de Fuca and on the other side by the Pacific Ocean. It contains peaks and valleys, river systems, jagged headlands. There is now a national marine sanctuary that wraps around it. So the ocean there is teeming with life. It is absolutely, I mean, you will see puffins, seals, you know, sea otters, just gray whales, all kinds of sea creatures that that are and were the plenty that allowed for the macaw to flourish there for thousands of years. So I was struck by the place itself, its beauty, its grandeur, and at the same time, the juxtaposition of a community of people who were relegated in some ways to not in some ways, relegated to a much narrower swath of their land than had been their usual and accustomed territory, which extended far beyond the reaches of the reservation itself. And the other thing that struck me about this place was the power of self-representation that is there through the Macaw Cultural and Research Center, that has an excellent website, and the Macaw territory is closed right now to outsiders because of the pandemic. But for those who are interested in learning more about this culture, the Macaw Cultural and Research Center houses one of the greatest trove of artifacts ever excavated in the United States. They call it sometimes America's Pompeii, in part because a landslide triggered by an earthquake buried a series of longhouses at the beach at Ozette, which is one of 5 ancestral villages that the Macaw occupied. And when that happened, all of those artifacts, technologies that were made out of materials that would otherwise have been lost to time, were preserved in salt water. And so one of the most beautiful things that's happened on Macaw territory post-contact in terms of in relationship with communities from outside is that the Macaw tribe worked with Doc Doherty, who is an archaeologist who I actually cite by name in the book, to excavate and catalog and then preserve in a tribally run museum, cultural center, these artifacts. And so there was this collaborative process that he helped broker. And one of the greatest honors of my life actually was on the behalf of the Macaw Cultural and Research Center, writing his obituary for their newsletter. I was able to interview his widow, Ruth Kirk, who has since died. She was an archaeologist and sociologist in her own right, and wrote a series of really good books based on the Olympic Peninsula. And she and Doc Doherty were actually married in the Longhouse at the MCRC inside. So they're a wonderful example of cultural engagement, which I cite like in the first chapter, actually. I'm like, not all, she was coasting this dead predecessor's wake. They're not all terrible, but then of course, Claudia is not going to be Doc Doherty, right? So she's bringing too much, she's coming in hot, too much damage.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah. And so the reason that was so meaningful for me was that when I was calling Doc Doherty's professional contacts, when I was interviewing Macaw elders, I was doing so on behalf of the Macaw Cultural and Research Center.
Yeah, that's significant.
It's extremely significant for me personally, and I am still grateful for that moment, actually. It's been years. So. So, okay, the place. So here's the thing. When you're writing about a place-based culture, if you're doing it properly, things will happen strangely, okay? So I went almost crazy writing this book. And I charted, because I made like 20 drafts of it. There's a reason when you get to the prose, it's pretty lyric, and there's a reason for that. I read it out loud to myself many, many, many times. I wanted to get it right. And so one of the things that I did is I was charting Peter and Claudia's on this legal pad, their rising and falling emotional intensity and action. And as I was doing that, what I saw in this, I did it next to each other, they formed this sine cosine wave where they seem like they're chasing each other and they're only ever intersecting at times of descent or ascent, but never truly together. Although their patterns together do make a harmony. And in certain ways, there are certain kind of sine cosine relationships that are fractal, and they can be found in sound, like the songs that they sing, and they can be found in ocean waves which surround them. And so what I found was that having spent so much time trying to absorb the landscape that surrounded these characters and really like feeling them, like trying to feel what they feel, I actually recreated a fractal pattern that was present in the place and dominated the place itself because of its kind of watery maritime surrounds. For anyone who would like to kind of do a deeper inquiry into the maritime culture of the Macaw, there's a really beautiful book called The Sea is My Country by Snohomish scholar Joshua Reed, and I highly recommend it.
Well, with everyone who's attending or is RSVP'd, we'll send some of these links in the follow-up. I also took down the Macaw Cultural Center. I want to ask one sort of personal question because we're almost at time, which is, this is all about culture and about, tradition and lineage. Do you have a favorite family or cultural tradition that you practice and hope to pass on to your family or to other people in your life?
One of the things that I think the Macaws have done very well is they're trying so hard to preserve their linguistic capacities. And they have hired new language teachers, and there's a whole system that is in place to train elders, children, middle schoolers, high schoolers. Something that I did is that I carried on a tradition of Spanish in my family that was actually severed before it got to me. So I was raised in a multilingual intergenerational household with a bunch of Cubans, and then my sister and I were the only people who were born on this soil in that household. And they all spoke Spanish, but they didn't speak Spanish to us. And one of the interesting things that I found about that is, of course, that's a assimilative practice. It's also, for a lot of people who've been through trauma, language can contain that trauma. And so they try to leave it behind. And that's something that Claudia does. She talks about the ache of her sister and the ache of her relationship with her family and the prejudice that she felt from her family about her when she was developing as a teenager, as a teenage girl with sexual needs. And so she leaves Spanish behind. Something that I did is that I, at the age of 8, it's like, y'all have made a terrible mistake. You taught me to say y'all and didn't teach me Spanish. So I learned. And because my abuela was living in the house with us, I was able to practice with her. And now I'm raising my children in Spanish. And that to me is a way of healing something that was ruptured through my family's assimilation to this country at a time when Cuba has been designated as an axis of evil, as a source of nuclear proliferation, as an example of everything that was negative about cultures that were not like the United States. And so by both returning to Cuba and doing a lot of research there for other projects, and by teaching my kids Spanish and only speaking to them in Spanish, I have tried to heal the wound that America did to us.
It's important. Yeah, my heritage is Polish, and I know very few words that were primarily from my grandparents, and it's such the touchstone of that memory and of those people. So thank you for sharing. I'm going to go ahead and stop the video now.
Bye.
We're all going to